I think people know this already by now, but most adult shops are nothing like people used to expect. I mean, sure, I'm sure they started out like that. Men in long coats buying dirty magazines hidden inside brown paper bags and then scurrying in and out as if they were committing a crime. These days, they're actually very clean, tasteful premises filled with a host of diverse clientele. There's no peep show behind a plastic curtain, no sticky pink carpet underfoot, no faint sounds of moaning coming from somewhere in the back, no 80s weird videos playing on a grainy TV bolted to a ceiling corner. There were stores like that, though, and I worked in one. And I'll just call it Angel's Delight, which was actually the name of the rival business my bosses hated. It was in a single-story mall on the outskirts of bumfrick nowhere, and even being a store that sold adult toys and dolls, we were still one of the classiest joints in that whole godforsaken building. I don't like to speak badly of others, but man, some of the motley crew that I got to know during my years in that place. There was the tattoo artist who I'm convinced could have made a stick figure look like complete crap, and there was the piercing store that basically guaranteed a ride on the sepsis train with every ear piercing. The liquor store where, rumor had it, the liquor was the least intoxicating thing they sold. Then there was the inexplicably high-fashion boutique run by an elderly, very conservative couple who were about as fire and brimstone as you could really get. And yet, every Friday night, they'd come into Angel's Delight and buy some of the most specific adult films we stocked. "Just doing our part to get this smut off the streets," the husband would say to me every single time while the wife clicked her tongue disapprovingly. If it was really for that purpose, then tell me, why did they only rid the streets of adult films that featured a very specific hole, a very specific racial combination, and came from a very specific production company whose movies had a serialized plot? Maybe they watched it for the articles. Genuinely, I heard about the articles so many times that I lost count. And my dude, I work here. I don't care. I'm not judging you. Hell, if you didn't slither in to buy hardcore adult mags, my bosses wouldn't be able to pay my wages and I'd have to take out student loans just to get through college. And that's why I was working there. I'd attended college for 1 year, and the crushing anxiety of even a partial student loan for that 1 year had led me to put school on hold and spend a few years working to earn enough to pay the rest of my way through. Adult shop manager was far from the only job I could find, but comfortably the best paying prospect I had. You'd think that a position in a shop like that would be easy to fill, haha, but when I first got the job, my bosses told me that I'd been only the second applicant. When I asked about the first, all they said was that some people were such big freaks that they could even scare away the hardcore fantasy crowd, and I didn't ask any further questions, just sort of snapped up the opportunity. And after a few years there, I was genuinely considering whether I wanted to go back to college or if I should focus on this career in this industry. Things are really going to pop off throughout the 2000s, my bosses said in 2002. Things were really looking positive for the brick-and-mortar adult shop field. And yeah, I'm glad I decided to go back to college the following year, and the event I'm going to tell you about played a big role in sending me running back to academia. It was an entirely unassuming fall Friday at the mall, a couple of hours from closing time, and we stayed open later than most stores due to the nature of our business, and other premises in the mall had already shut their doors for the night. Mr. and Mrs. Fashion Boutique had already been and gone with their latest VHS acquisition. The day was winding down nicely, and like I said, most of our customers kind of snuck quietly into the store. Not this guy. The front door came flying open with such force that I discovered that it had permanently broken the chair of the little bell that hung above it, and that was the least of my worries, though. The guy came sort of stalking through the store. He was tall, really tall, easily 6.5 feet tall, but he wasn't big. He wasn't muscular or broad, just very lanky, not really imposing or anything, kind of gangly, and if he hadn't burst in like that and stormed toward the counter, I wouldn't have thought anything of him. Instead, I had to, because he got all up in my face, slamming down a brown paper bag he jabbed toward me with his finger. "This product is defective, and I'm going to return it for a refund." I rolled my eyes visibly and gestured to the huge no return sign on the wall over my shoulder. "You can return this," he insisted. I knew better than to reach into any brown paper bag purchased from Angel's Delight. The bosses told me how some frat bros would try to return their used adult toys as a prank, and to this day I don't know if this was a joke or an urban legend or what, and it's never happened to me, but I'd be damned if I was going to risk touching anything that had been in anyone else. What's the item?" I asked. "Can you remove it from the bag?" The guy sighed theatrically and took the product out of the bag. I didn't recognize it immediately, but he flipped the box over and I saw that it was an inflatable rubber mask. Kind of like a GIMP mask, but made of stretchy latex rubber. A hose ran from the mouth hole to a pump and the mask could be inflated while being worn. I had no idea when this item had been purchased. We'd had one in stock ever since I'd worked there, and at some point in the last few months it had been sold when someone else was on shift. I knew it had to be over a week ago because I noticed it was gone from the wall by then. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. The guy fumbled with the box, not out of embarrassment, I don't think, but anger. He pulled the rubber mask out, the hose flapping against the counter, and he held it up. "It's torn. Look," he said, and there was a tear at the neck, as if the material had sort of corroded. Hell, maybe that's exactly what had happened. I know rubber and latex expire after a while, and the mask could have been ancient, just sitting on the wall since the store opened in the 80s. Might be entirely not this guy's fault, and his GIMP mask had unfortunately been defective. No returns absolutely meant no returns, though, even in a case like this, and the only way my bosses would have allowed me to refund a customer would have been out of my own pocket. And if you agree to no returns ever, then that means no returns ever. Why should I have to give this guy $20 plus sales tax out of my own hard-earned money? That's a shame," I said. "I guess you should have been more careful when you were putting it on." And I know I was being a jerk, but I didn't like this guy getting all up in my face. And oh boy, did I pay for it. I barely had time to react when Tall Man reached over the counter, grabbed me by the back of the head, and slammed my cheek against the desk. I could feel the pump of the goddamn GIMP mask pressing into my temple. Tall Man leaned down to my ear, and he didn't whisper when he spoke, and I'm afraid that I'll have to paraphrase here. The years haven't been kind to my memory, so I don't have a perfect recollection of exactly what he said, but I think you'll get the gist. "Listen here, you smut-peddling, smug dipstick. I know it says no returns, but you sold me a defective item. Would you expect to pay someone else's mistakes? No. Then why should I be expected to pay for yours?" He pressed down harder on my head, and I swear to God, I thought my skull was going to pop right then and there. The guy was way stronger than he looked. "Nuh-uh," I remember blabbering through my mouth, mushed into the desk. "No, sir. So I want to return this item for a refund," he said, and he held me there for a second, and I wondered what the holdup was. Then I felt the cold metal press against my head. "I want a refund," he said. Then the metallic touch left me, and after a few seconds he let go. When I straightened up and could see properly, I didn't see a gun on him, and like most people in October, he was wearing a long coat, and to this day, I can't say for sure that this angry adult shop customer had held a goddamn gun to my head over a $20 inflatable GIMP mask. I'm not sure. But what I can say for sure is that he got his money back. Hell, I gave him $30 because I was shaking too much to count out the right amount. And then it was like his whole demeanor changed. He brightened, smiled, thanked me, and then left the store. And he even took that mask in the bag with him. And so I couldn't even prove to my bosses that any of it had really happened. Not that I would have called the cops anyways. Not in that mall. Not when I was working at that store. It wasn't the really kind of place where you even bothered with the cops. I did tell the bosses about it though, expecting them to probably doubt me, but when I described the guy, They seemed to know exactly who I was talking about. "Oh yeah, him," the one boss said. "He can get like that sometimes," the other boss added. "Next time, just process the return." Now that night I decided that I'd saved up more than enough money to go back to college, and so the next day I handed in my notice, worked out my next 60 days, and then left that mall adult shop industry and never looked back. I'll get this out of the way up front. My name is Paul, and I was a mall cop. You'd think this would have been unbearable, but I served my stint as a security guard at a certain small-town mall in the 90s, so I'd left the job before the movie came out. I worked in private security now, but back then I was employed directly by the mall. It wasn't a huge mega mall by any means, but it had a couple of stores, about 20 stores in fact, and a food court, and a central fountain that the kids would throw coins into and make a wish. What this mall did have was a huge warehouse complex at the back. This is one of the big draws for businesses in the mall. They got a portion of the warehouse area as part of their lease to store stock and what have you, and some of them didn't need it and others took advantage of it. Then other local businesses would lease warehouse space to store their own goods and items. The point is, this mall had a large maze of interior storage units out the back, so the area of the mall that shoppers saw was maybe only 40% of the property. Shoppers would stroll around browsing Radio Shack or Borders or that one store that always stuck out to me, Gadzooks, all sorts of clothing stores too. I won't explain the mall layout exactly. It was haphazardly built, kind of a pain in the ass to get around, and sometimes you could find yourself in one section of the mall's upper floor and you'd have to go down one escalator and back up another to get to the other side. If by any small chance anyone who lived in the area around the 90s is listening, this description plus the storage warehouses is probably enough to make it clear which mall I actually mean. If you know, you know, as my kids say. I'm painting this picture so you understand that the mall wasn't some big open-plan architectural masterpiece with wide walkways for shoppers. It was cramped, claustrophobic, and by the time I started working there in the 90s, it was already feeling run down and out of time. Couple that with a huge warehouse complex out back, and you can imagine why they needed round-the-clock security. There was a lot to explore, a lot of hidden corners that could hide all sorts of ill behavior. And for the first year on the job, I barely had to deal with anything more than a few shoplifters. One old guy was perving on a young woman, a missing kid who was found safe and well sitting in a photo booth, and a few kids who got dared to try and sneak into the warehouse to stay overnight. Weirdly, they were the ones that management came down on the hardest. Really wanted to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. In the end, nothing came of it. They were barely older than 18, but the bosses were weirdly angry about someone trying to stay in the mall overnight. I guess when you think about it, they could have caused untold damage, but like I said, we were a 24-hour security detail, so one of us on shift would have caught them pretty quickly. The weirdness really began a couple of years into the job. The first time, my buddy Chris and I were on a mall shift, and an older, more seasoned guy, Bryn, was in the security office monitoring the cameras. It was mid-afternoon, mid-week, and the mall was average busy. Then I get a call over the radio. It's Bryn. He told me we had a code whatever in my sector and for an unattended package. Now, this was one thing that would make most of us jumpy. We were only a few years past the Oklahoma City bombing, and tensions were still high about any abandoned packages or vehicles in populated public areas. We never had a direct bomb threat, but we'd found a few abandoned bags and things. I guess we were pretty reckless, because we'd never called in a bomb squad. Usually you could just see that they were things shoppers had bought and accidentally left beside a bench and whatnot. This time, it was one of those filthy duffel bags tucked underneath a bench in the corner overlooking the central fountain. Nobody was looking at it when I reached the area Bryn directed me to. I'm not sure if nobody had noticed or nobody cared, but I remember that damn bag like it was yesterday. It was dirty, like it had regularly been rolled in dust and debris and maybe chalk, and as I got closer, it was clear that it stank. Of piss, of all things. I remember thinking, who pisses on a goddamn bomb? And that's why I just sort of strolled up to that damn bag and grabbed it, just swung it out from under the bench. I know, I was an effing idiot and I put lives at risk. Present-day me would give my past self a swift backhand to the head, but I was a dumb kid. And in my defense, as I'd gotten close, I could see the bag was open and that there were clothes inside, and that's where the piss stink was coming from. And that's what was in the bag. A black sweater, a pair of black jogging pants, a pair of black socks, all stinking and clearly well worn. No big deal, I thought. Someone just kind of abandoned their old clothes after buying a new fit that day, I guess. The only slightly odd thing was the filthy plush cat also tucked into that duffel bag. Clearly an old, much-loved childhood toy. I don't remember much about it, to be honest, but at the time I just shoved it back into that duffel bag, a bit disgusted at the smell, and tried to push down any thoughts of what the cuddly toy might imply, or who it belonged to. I radioed Bryn that everything was fine. It was just a bag of clothes, and took it out to the dumpsters out back, making sure to thoroughly wash my hands afterwards. Didn't even get reprimanded for my reckless decision to grab a potential bomb. Nothing happened for a week or two. And then, like deja vu, I get a message over the radio again from Bryn about an abandoned bag. Don't be a dumbass with it this time, kid. He'd seen me swipe it up on the cameras, of course, so not much point in hiding it from him, and I confirmed that I would not. Went to the area that he directed me to, beside one of those fake plants in another forgotten corner of the mall, and sure enough, there was an identical duffel bag. This one didn't reek though, and it was clearly a newer bag, but aside from that, it was the same. This time it was more out in the open, so even though it was a bit reckless, I was able to approach and sort of peer into it without touching anything. Again, I know I was an idiot for not even calling this one in, but to my underdeveloped mind, I could see that it was clothes again, so it was going to be the same thing, and I was sort of right. There was no plush cat this time or toy of any kind. Instead, there were a few food wrappers, junk food that you get from a grocery store, sort of like Twinkies and beef jerky, that kind of thing, and some packaged goods. So either that was a goddamn weird coincidence, or the same guy had left the same generic set of clothes and the same brand of duffel bag lying around the mall twice in 1 month. Despite this one not being so foul, I still disposed of it in the dumpsters out back, and really thought nothing of it beyond mentioning it to Bryn and a couple of other colleagues. The next duffel bag sighting came only a few days later. This time one of the store workers had found it in a female dressing room, and by now, talk of the previous 2 duffel bags that I'd found had spread around some of the workers, which I guess is why they called this in. I remember talking to the girl who called it in. She was barely over 18, and she went totally white when I said that it could have been an explosive device. Hadn't even considered it. I acted all macho and sort of stern about it, like I'd been the picture of responsibility when I'd found mine. Yeah, not really. The girl had already opened the bag, so there were no surprises this time except for the smell. This one stank even worse than the first one. Really old, musty, rotten almost. Thankfully no piss this time, but that didn't make it better. The girl looked like she was about to puke, so being the gallant, manly security guard that I was, I took it off of her hands and, you guessed it, to the dumpster out back. This time I didn't even check if there was anything else in there besides clothes. I wasn't touching that crap. And so by now, we've had 3 abandoned identical duffel bags with 3 abandoned identical sets of clothes. I think it was Chris who first brought this up one day on break. And due to the job, it was rare for us to take breaks at the same time as each other, but for some reason that day, we were. "Maybe there's someone living in the mall," he said. He was joking, but I latched onto it, coming up with arguments about why that could be right, how it made sense, etc. In the end, I think Chris kinda got annoyed with me and left, telling me that I was some conspiracy theorist or something like that, and maybe he just didn't want to deal with the possibility. But no, hear me out. My logic went like this. 3 identical duffel bags, 3 generic identical outfits. 2 of them had clearly been dumped because they were stinking and old, and who knows about the middle bag. Maybe there was some damage to the clothes that I didn't see because I didn't exactly examine them or anything. Maybe the guy had crapped his pants that time, who knows? So I started putting together reasons why the details could be the way that they were. Because the guy was taking them out of the storage warehouses. They were stock from one of the clearance outlets in the mall. You know the type. Sells cheap clothing, bags, all that good stuff. So this guy was dressing in cheap clothing from the warehouse and, what, living in there? When I present it all like this, it makes me sound like some crack detective who worked this out in seconds, with one of those boards with red string and all of that kind of stuff. It wasn't like that. It took a few weeks for me to put all these pieces together. It's something I thought about absently from time to time, and during this period, a fourth duffel bag had been found in one of the men's public restrooms on the first floor. Nothing to do with me that time, but I heard about it from the guy who found it, and this time it had been found emptied all over the ground, the contents kind of just strewn about. The theory was that someone else had found it before us and gone through it to see if there was anything worth stealing. Hell, maybe there had been, but I don't think so. It was just the old clothes or more perishable food wrappers. My chance came a few weeks later. It was my turn to switch with the night guys, and I liked the night shift. I was just coming out of a bad breakup at the time, so I liked the silence, the time to think. I've always been that kind of person when there's badness afoot. I like to be by myself, kind of lost in my own head, and I have a couple of creepy hiking experiences because of this that I might send in one day, who knows. And so I was glad that I had the night shift because I needed the space for my head, but I also am glad because it gave me an excuse to poke around the warehouse unimpeded. I tried to bring it up with colleagues in the previous weeks, but the senior boys in particular were very keen to dissuade us from poking around back there, and at the time, I started to entertain some really weird thoughts about it all, but later discovered that it was totally unconnected. Some local business that rented this space did so under the agreement that poking around wouldn't happen, and I guess that explains the haphazard security cam coverage in the warehouse areas too. Certain areas, especially inside Warehouse B, were complete camera blind spots for the most part. I had a pretty strong suspicion that the blind spot areas, and thus the areas my night shift led me to patrol the most, were where someone might actually be hiding. I've told events slightly out of order because I guess I have a flair for the dramatic, and in the weeks leading up to the start of my night shift, I'd become convinced that I was seeing things. Nothing wild, not talking or creepypasta tier, just obvious things. Glimpses of black-clad men carrying that specific black duffel bag, always blending into a crowd or disappearing around a corridor. People whose faces I could never get a full look at, who always seemed to be deliberately keeping just out of my reach. But at the time, I knew that I'd look like a nut job if I pursued that, or even told anyone. Hell, maybe in the years since I've built it up in my head and remember it happening more often than it did, but it's enough that even looking back now, it gives me, the grown-ass man who's worked some tough security jobs, the shivers. There was something about the shapelessness of it. The idea that someone wearing black was sneaking around the mall, my mall, even though they hadn't done anything bad except for leaving stinking clothes around. Well, not yet anyway. So, first night shift, I almost ran to the Warehouse B route in eagerness. Dumb, I know, but when I got there, I kind of paced myself, started walking the route normally. The warehouses had lights, and we were allowed to have them on during patrol, so it wasn't some sinister pitch-black walk through the dark, or at least it wasn't meant to be. I walked the route, probably whistling, trying to look like a picture of doesn't care to who, no idea, and this area wasn't even covered by cameras. But then I started looking a little closer at things. Just take a look, I thought, you know? And I remembered this shelving unit belonged to one of the clothing clearance stores, and I figured that it wouldn't hurt to double-check the boxes, you know, that kind of thing. Like I was trying to convince myself in my own head that I wasn't investigating the idiotic idea of someone living in the back corridors and hidden corners of the mall, because obviously that wasn't happening. How could it have been? Why would someone? But then, I found the nest. Yeah, okay, it wasn't a nest like that, not some creature's lair, but it was a collection of boxes on a huge bottom shelf that had been opened and taped together to form a kind of tiny room. It was barely disguised, and I have no idea how anyone missed it before I found it. To this day, there's a tiny part of me that suspects that he wanted to be found, and specifically by me, because I had been the one to find his first duffel bag. And I'm sure that's just my dramatic side talking again, but, you start to wonder. As mall security, we had these extendable baton things, and I never had a cause to use mine for violence, and I hope that night wouldn't change that. But I had been waiting for an excuse to extend it with a whooshing wrist flick motion in the line of duty, which I did at that moment, or at least tried to. Of course, that's the time that it didn't work properly and the baton got stuck and I had to extend it by hand, and I'd shown that move off to buddies God knows how many times, and the one time I finally got to use it, I fumbled it. So I approached this obvious nest of boxes. Of course, I didn't know what was inside at this point, just that it was a bunch of boxes taped together, and I could see an opening in a space beyond. "Hey, anyone in there?" I called out. "Mall security. I'm giving you one chance to come out with your hands up." I don't know why I said with your hands up. We didn't carry guns. It just sounded like something I should say. "Yeah?" I called out, or something else, and there was no movement from inside the box, and I reached forward with my baton and parted the flap that served as a door. And holy crapola, the stench. It was honestly like chemical warfare. Jesus Christ, and until that point, I'd had no idea that the simple odor of the human body could end up being that foul. It wasn't soil from a human or anything like that. It was purely the stench of human existence. No wonder this guy, and it obviously was this guy, kept disposing of his bags of clothes. There was a bundle of generic brand sleeping bags in the nest, one clearly slept in and the others used for padding. I mean, the guy had access to all of this backlog stock, so why not? There were also 2 or 3 of the black duffel bags in there, still in cellophane wrapping, and a stack of the generic black clothes that I'd been finding. I backed up a little bit and assessed my surroundings, trying to place which store this particular area of storage belonged to. And then things clicked into place. This shelving area had belonged to the budget clothing store that had gone out of business last year. I guess for whatever reason they shut down suddenly and left their stock behind, and eventually someone would have come to clear it out. I had no idea what happened in a case like that, though. I wasn't a retail worker. I do remember that around then it was unusual, but not unheard of, for a store to suddenly shut down. And clearance generic brand clothing sold cheap. You don't have to be a genius to connect that kind of store with sweatshops. So who knew what possible reasons could have led to a shutdown and abandonment of stock? Now, leaning back in, covering my nose, I tentatively peered into the den that my squatter had been inhabiting. Nothing else really identifying or interesting, and I figured that we'd have to call the cops to report an intruder, and they could go through this little living area and the warehouse overall and search for any identification or evidence of wrongdoing besides breaking and entering. I was a security guard, not a detective, and it wasn't my job to investigate the crime, just to stop it from happening. It felt like an anticlimax, but I was relieved to finally have the matter taken out of my hands. As I backed away from the den and straightened up, I realized 2 things at once. 1, the den was empty, which meant the guy was gone. And 2, the den was empty, which meant the guy could be anywhere. And I fumbled for my radio, dropped the freaking thing because of course I wasn't acting like the manly hero I'd always pictured in those scenarios. Then, when I was sure the brick of a unit wasn't broken, I radioed through to the security office. One of my favorite colleagues was on that night, and she was a motherly figure who brought in home-baked goods, and we all affectionately called her Mom. I can't even remember her real name, to be honest with you, and how she ended up in mall security was something I'll never figure out, but of all the senior guards who could be working the cameras on any night, having Mom there was a particular reassurance. I realize now how weird it must have sounded to be overheard saying, "Mom, I think there's a guy down here," into the radio. But it was the squatter guy who would have heard me, so screw him. Naturally, she radioed back asking me to confirm just what in the blue blazing hell I was talking about and whether I was okay. I didn't even have time to reply when and I swear to Jesus Christ Almighty above, the lights for the entire Warehouse B building went out. Boom. Total pitch black darkness. And this wasn't something that often happened. There was no fancy timer, no famous generator problems. If the lights went out, it was because someone hit the switches. My mind didn't run through the usual "I'm being pranked" nonsense. The nest, the duffel bags, they were not a prank. Nobody I worked with had the imagination or the motivation to pull off something so elaborate. Just wasn't a thing. So the only explanation I even entertained was that the guy who had been living in the mall was still in the warehouse and had just shut off the lights. Thankfully, we carried flashlights on the night shift, and I tried to get mine off of my belt just as, and I swear to God, I heard footsteps pounding across the warehouse floor. Running footsteps coming directly at me. Fast. The light switches weren't far from where I was. I got my flashlight up just in time to see someone wearing black, a scrawny figure charging straight at me. He barrels into me at just the wrong moment, catching me perfectly off guard so that I fell right backward, slamming against a shelf. I heard him mutter something, saw him stumble in the waving beam of my flashlight, and then just take off down the aisle. God damn it. What should I even do, I thought. I wasn't paid nearly enough to get murdered on the job, but my pride had been hurt, and my shoulder. So, I got up and ran after him as I radioed to Mom, panting out what details I could, getting frustrated as she kept asking me to repeat things. The guy seemed like he was darting down corridors in the dark, and I was barely keeping up with him using just my flashlight. In the end, I just yelled for Mom to call the cops to the warehouses, now, and drop the radio so I could run faster. For a moment, I lost him. Then I heard a door slam somewhere down a corridor and knew where he must have been headed. There was a small complex of rooms between warehouses A and B, just a break room, a bathroom, etc., and I started jogging down there. And for all I knew, he was waiting on the other side of the door with a machete or a gun or even a fire extinguisher, and I probably didn't take nearly enough care as I burst in. The lights were still on in there, causing me to kind of wince and reel back, and thankfully, no weaponized squatter was there waiting for me, just an open door leading into the bathroom. I went through the open door. The bathrooms in that area were 2 individual rooms, men's and women's, with 1 toilet, 1 sink, etc. in each. These weren't public bathrooms, just for people who had reason to be in the warehouse zone. The women's bathroom was open and I could see a ceiling vent covering lying on the ground like it had been pulled off and tossed aside. I stepped in and shone my flashlight up into that hole, and I thought I could hear the faint sound of someone crawling away through those vents, but maybe that was just my imagination. I was so fixated on the vent that it took me a moment to notice the writing in the mirror. Now, I can't say for sure that it was from this guy. It could have just been graffiti left by literally anyone at any time, but like I said, these were worker bathrooms, the female bathroom as well. Does that really matter here? I tend to think of women as just generally less likely to vandalize bathrooms, and if that makes me sexist, so be it. I just couldn't imagine anyone doing it in their own workplace. And on the mirror, in Sharpie, someone had just written the F word and eat poop. Not exactly written like that. Laid out exactly like that, with the F word on one line and eat poop on the next. I remember the exact wording to this day, and to this day, I have no idea if our guys sharply simply just didn't work for the word off after the top line, or if he wrote exactly what he meant to write. Sadly, I can't tell you that I pursued him into those vents like some action hero, or Batman, I guess. Absolutely not. Sorry, I wasn't about to die in a vent in my 20s for an almost minimum wage security job. I'm not die hard. And I waited for the cops, who showed up very shortly after. Now I'll rush through what happened next. Basically, the cops investigated, and we had, indeed, had a squatter living in the mall. He hadn't limited himself to his den in that warehouse either. The cops, management, and us guards found at least 4 other areas around the mall, and only one of them was in the warehouse. The others, well, we'll just say that he got around the whole complex. It was an old maze-like building, as I said earlier. not all that hard to get lost in the corridors and maintenance closets and the vents and the gaps between stores. In every little nest that he had, we found duffel bags in the same black outfits. We never found any boots, though. He'd been wearing heavy boots when he charged me, and I remember those thundering footsteps. I guess his boots meant something to him, so he never changed them. But the clothes, yeah, just these basic black garments. And trash, loads of food wrappers from stuff that he'd stolen from the warehouse and eaten. Nothing really nutritional, and he must have been in terrible health by the time I chased him off. And we really found nothing else. No sort of manifesto, no sinister plans, no other writing, no ID, no personal belongings. But I always remember how in that first duffel bag, there was that one dirty plush cat. And had I thrown that guy's one beloved possession into the dumpster out back? And is that why he told me to F off and eat crap? And that phrase became a running joke around the security guards for a while, until, like all things, it eventually fizzled out. It was kind of just easier to focus on that than consider how incredibly creepy and unsafe it was that someone had been living in the walls of the mall for who knows how long. Probably the same reason management was very focused on keeping it covered up. I never found proof that anything truly terrible had happened, but of course the vents and crawl spaces had access to the bathrooms and the private and public ones. There were dressing rooms, all sorts of places for someone to hide, and if they were so inclined, he might even watch. We all publicly agreed that it was better to just not know, as long as he never came back, and you can believe security was pretty tightened up, at least for a while. I left the role about 18 months later, and by then, things had calmed down somewhat. But those of us who had been there at the time still talked about that shadow in the walls, so I really don't have any definitive conclusion about who this creepy, stinky guy was that knocked me over, and I know that's pretty disappointing, but I do know who he was, sort of. As about 10 years later after I left that job, I was in a very different place and position in life. I was in a relationship with someone who would later become my wife, and she was also from the same town. We'd grown up together, but not together, if that makes sense. The kind of relationship where you meet later in life and remember each other. She knew about that mall shadow, obviously, and many of the other bizarre stories. But this one had always stuck with her because she'd been to that same mall many times. Even though we lived across the country by that point, my wife, though we weren't married yet when this happened, still got our local weekly paper mailed to us by her mom. It was sort of a cute thing, but now I kind of wonder if her mom did it purely for this purpose. There was a story a few pages in about a man who had been arrested. His charges were stalking, harassment, and conspiracy to kidnap. He appeared to be an unhoused individual and had been living pretty rough, while repeatedly stalking a handful of women in the area. This time, when they picked him up, they had found a manifesto. According to the newspaper report, it was a notebook that he had just filled with scrawlings about one unnamed young woman in particular. I couldn't find any more about the case online and never really have, even in the years since, and I guess the charges were eventually dropped, or maybe he died or something. He looked very sickly in his mugshot that they printed out, and I only saw his face once, in a sort of frantic flashlight all the way back then, while he was charging at me, so I can't be certain. But I know that was him. That was the guy who had been living in those dens throughout that goddamned mall. And it just goes to show you that you really never know who's out there. You may never find out what people are thinking or what they might do if pushed just the right way. And sometimes just thinking about that keeps me up at night more than any confirmed murder or direct act of violence. Just the idea that it could happen at any time, from anywhere. So just for clarity, I'm British, and I have a bit of an unusual job. I go from place to place, usually at night, all around the country, fixing vending machines, jukeboxes, and arcade cabinets. My company hires and trains people to fix any of these devices that someone might rent for their public space. 95% of my work is vending machines. Usually some crap like a pack of space raiders had gotten stuck in the prongs, and nobody's confident enough to give it a good thwack. I don't advise that anyway, it voids your warranty. Now anyways, sometimes it's more fun though, and I get called halfway across the country to fix Mario Kart. If I'm really lucky, it's a classic arcade cabinet, an actual honest-to-God 80s one that's still functioning. These things are surprisingly robust and mostly just need a bit of maintenance. Tonight's job was in a motorway service station that's attached to a much bigger mall. After hours, only the service station area was open, which was a large open-plan room with a row of fast food kiosks, a side room with a few arcade machines, a corridor leading to public toilets, and then a big crate that would normally lead into the now darkened mall. I pulled into the car park. The huge unlit mall loomed over like a squat brick house, and honestly, the lights of the service station area were really welcome at that point. I'd been driving for hours, I was frazzled and craving a cup of garbage vending machine coffee. The car park had a few vehicles in it. I grabbed my bags out of the back of the van and headed into the service station. It was warm and smelled of McDonald's, very lush. My stomach rumbled, but the rule is no food until after I'd done the job. I grabbed a cup of black coffee with 2 sugars from the vending machine and headed over to the job, which in this instance was a 2-player Mario Kart arcade GP cabinet. One of the seats had come loose and one of the wheels had some drift to it, so I just needed to do a bit of maintenance. I got the job done in half an hour, quicker than I'd anticipated, and I'm pretty single-minded, so I hadn't really taken in my surroundings until this point. I guess I'm not one of those constantly hyper-aware true crime buffs who sometimes write in, who assess every possible threat. There were 3 fast food kiosks, which seemed to be staffed by just one person, a bored-looking middle-aged man with tattoos running up his gloved arms. In the back corner sat a group of people in hoodies who I guessed were teens, and then at a table in the middle sat 2 women, maybe early 20s. They seemed nice, so I smiled and nodded to them and then headed over to grab my usual filet-of-fish meal order. Yeah, I'm the one who orders that. I got the food from the grumpy fast food worker, sat down, and began chowing down on my fries. I was about halfway through the meal when the group in the corner got up from where they'd been huddling. When they stood, I could see that they were all decently tall, except for one of them who was particularly short. Nothing unusual, just notable, and made me doubt that they were actually teenagers anyways. My heart fell when I saw that they were all wearing masks. Again, nothing ridiculous, just scarf-type masks pulled right below their eyes and hoodies pulled down low. You know, the usual picture the British tabloids paint of knife crime hoodie youths. In my experience, though, that's mostly scaremongering and bluster, so if anything, I thought this was a wind-up. At least I really hope so, as the group of 4 made their way over to my table. They stood there facing me, no speaking, nothing. "Can I help you, fellas?" I asked, and I was trying to sound polite and not rattled, and I'm not exactly some weakling, but I'm not eager for a fight either. I was trying to catch the eye of the girls at the center table to see if they were in on it or anything, and the hoodie gang stared at me. Then one of them lunged forward and shoved the table. Not hard, but enough to try and make me jump. Absolutely classic school bully behavior. "All right, lads. I'm just trying to wind down after work. Don't want any trouble. Be on your way now." I thought I heard one of them giggle like that was hilarious. Idiot. The one who shoved the table leaned in and said, "You got a problem, mate," he hissed. Oh, okay. They were angry little lads with something to prove. "No, mate. Just trying to eat my burger." "No, mate. Just trying to eat my burger," he echoed. Just trying to eat my burger," one of the other tall ones said. The third tall one slammed a gloved fist down on the table, and my drink toppled over and I caught it before it could hit the floor. "Come on, lads," I said. "It's not worth it, is it?" I hadn't noticed the short one circling around behind me while the others distracted me. Hands fell on my shoulders. "Not worth it." And the voice was quiet, and I couldn't tell you if it was a girl or a little kid, and my gut says that it was probably a kid, maybe both, probably why I didn't immediately respond with a swift over-the-shoulder elbow. "All right, forget this," I said, standing up. The hoodie behind me had to jump backward to avoid getting hit by the cheap service station chair. I grabbed my bags and made my way to the entrance, and of course that gang followed me. "Oi, bud, "I'm sticking around." They jeered. But I was over it. I'd dealt with my fair share of schoolyard bullies and, well, obviously school, but I was way too old for this bollocks, even if it meant abandoning a McDonald's. And as we walked into that car park, I hoped that the service station worker would have the sense to lock the doors behind the gang, or maybe these kids were known to the service station folk, I suppose. Maybe this kind of thing happened here all the time. And as I fumbled at my van for the key, I saw the two women looking at us from the window. The gang were in the middle of the car park, about 5 or 6 meters away from me, and they were just watching me. I didn't want to turn my back on them by going to the back of the van, so I opened the passenger door and threw my bags onto the seat, keeping my eye on them. I did slip a socket wrench out of one of the bags, though, and hid it up my sleeve. "All right, I'll be off, lads," I said, backing around the van to the driver's side. I thought it would probably be better to keep engaging them instead of acting too scared. "Keep up the bullcrap, I guess." And they stood there and just simply watched as I got into the van, and I gunned that engine and put it into reverse, and I thought that I was going to get away scot-free. Then suddenly, they charged toward the van, just ran at the bonnet, slapping on it, hooting and hollering like some hyenas, and I jumped visibly and they just laughed harder. They had no fear at all that I might just drive into them or anything, so I slammed down on the pedal and peeled backwards in a U-shape through the almost empty car park and drove off. They chased me as I turned, slapping and banging on the side of the van a few times and then sank back into the darkness. Maybe I should have just run them over, but I bet that would have worked out worse for me than them, especially if one of them really was some kid. I stopped at a later service station to see if any damage had been done, and there was a big, thin gash along the side of the van. It definitely looked like it had been scraped with a knife. I spoke to my boss and then did call the cops, who said that there was always trouble at that service station and they'd swing by. I never heard anything about it, though. The thing that terrifies me is that I'm not convinced they intended to let me get away. The way they lost control at the end there, like these wild beasts. I'm certain if I'd gotten out to confront them, I wouldn't have been leaving that service station in one piece. I live in a country where certain bad things are even more taboo than they are in the West. We do not like to speak about them, and one such time was in this tale told to me by my mother. In my municipality, there was a local shopping center that had recently been torn down, and I remember that when I was small, I used to visit this mall, and it was filled with smiling, laughing faces, people buying things, having a good time. I remember there was a food court on the bottom floor with all sorts of sights and smells that captivated my young mind, cookies baking in a kiosk that smelled delicious, and cuisine from all over the world. I loved going to that mall, running about and looking at all the stores, and I recall this huge spread of goods and services, from colorful children's toys to beautiful clothes we dreamed of wearing someday. And to me, as a child, this mall seemed like a magical wonderland, and trips there with my mother, father, and siblings, or with friends and their parents, were always very special and happy times. Now, when I was about 6, we were told that the shopping center would be closing down, and I remember crying. I knew my father worked there, and I believed that the mall closing would mean that he would lose his job. But no, he did not work for the mall itself. He was the manager of a chain store inside, and he had recently been promoted anyway. I soon forgot about my sadness, the mall, and moved on to other things as I grew up. It was only years later, returning home to visit my parents and seeing the news of the center's final fate, the demolition of the long-abandoned building, that I learned the true story of the mall's closure. It happened in the summer, shortly after the mall had closed to the public for the night. This shopping center was small, but very tall. There were perhaps 6 stores on each floor, with the food court taking up almost all of the bottom level. The next floor held toys and electronics and fun things, and above that was clothing and home goods, and finally on the top floor, some office space and a single stationery store I remember finding sort of exciting. The center of the shopping mall was open to the skies with a large sculpture roughly in the middle, and on a bright day, the sun would catch the sculpture just right, casting a sort of rainbow effect. And because of the dizzying height and the open design of the central column, each floor had strong reinforced glass to prevent anyone from falling to their doom. And I remember looking through the glass on the top floor, not even tall enough to look fully over the side, sort of craning my neck to try and see all the way down to the bottom. Of course I couldn't, but I remember that the balcony's walls were higher than my head, so they must have come up to about chest height for an average adult man. The store my father managed was a sort of menswear shop on the third tier. That summer, the company he worked for had recently collaborated with a notable fashion designer, and a product release party was held in his store. It was just a small affair with a handful of fashion journalists and photographers and a select group of customers invited for early access to the products. And that's why there were maybe 15 people in my father's store that evening after closing time. My mother cannot explain why she stepped out of that store at that moment. She recalls needing some air, but she's never been the type to need some air. She says that she's been outside no more than a minute when the body fell from the sky. He was not close to her, but rather directly opposite across the central opening of the mall. A man fell seemingly from nowhere. He was wearing a brown business suit, and as he fell, his jacket flapped like wings and his tie cracked almost like a whip. About 3/4 of the way down, one of his shoes came off and veered off course, perhaps from the flailing of his legs. His face showed first shock and then terror, and then he vanished from my mother's view. He didn't scream, and my mother made a point of this to say that the man didn't yell, cry out, or scream. He just uttered no sound at all. Then he hit the ground, a hard, solid floor from a great height. My mother won't say more about what followed, but I do know that when a body falls from that height, it is no longer a body when it hits the ground. And I know that what remains spreads out so far and wide that it's easier to close down a mall forever than try to clean it all away. And that is not the only reason that the mall closed forever that night. The man who fell was the proprietor of the mall itself. Apparently, the mall had been suffering from severe financial difficulties, and the management company was on the verge of bankruptcy. What this would have meant for the mall or for the stores operating within it, I'm not sure. It was deemed a terrible accident that the mall's proprietor fell from the top floor, over a chest-high balcony railing, on a night when the mall should have been closed but wasn't. Perhaps he forgot that and was leaning over to adjust or clean something when he slipped. Perhaps contrary to what authorities believed, he was not alone that night. Or perhaps something else happened, deliberate and personal. But out of respect for the deceased's family, in a place like the one I grew up in, when a tragedy like this occurs, you learn what is and isn't okay to speculate about. All that's left behind is an abandoned building, now reduced to rubble, and the memory of the man who fell from the sky. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button over here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Slay Queen.